Welcome back to another episode of Historical Weaponry. Today we'll be discussing the origins of the German longsword and how it transformed from an instrument of war to the controlled sport of fencing. Without further ado, let's begin. The German longsword first appeared around the middle 1300s AD during the Middle Ages, or High Middle Ages to be specific, and the mindful study of this form was called Kunst des Fechtens, translated as the art of fencing. As with most swords of the era, longswords were used primarily as sidearms, since pole arms and bows were the first line of defense to keep as much distance from the enemy as possible in battle. Swords were mainly used when that distance became close range, since they could be drawn from a scabbard fairly quickly, or at least they should be able to do just that. The German longsword reached its peak popularity between 1350 and 1550, when it was used by military forces and mercenaries in large-scale combat. While it was originally used by cavalrymen riding horseback or other high-ranking individuals who could afford plate armor, sometime around the latter half of the 1400s saw a shift where unarmored fighters were using these too. But aside from battle, the longsword found its niche in society as being the cool, shiny thing throughout the entire period of its popularity, because not only was it popular in warfare, it was fashionable in everyday life as well. This even includes being the tool by which tournaments and judicial duels were performed. So before pistols had their heyday for settling conflicts like that $2 debt Mr. Jeffries owed Mr. Silverman, longswords were the primary equalizers. Longswords and sidearms in general in the medieval period were essentially like revolvers in the Wild West, carried by pretty much anyone who could afford them. So it wouldn't have been altogether strange to see everyone in town walking around with a sword on their hip. Going out for stew because you don't feel like cooking? Expect most patrons at the tavern to have a sword. Grocery shopping at the street market? Expect the sweet old Mrs. Potato Grower to be packing. Okay, maybe not that last one, but you get my point. The longsword's military use faded towards the end of the 1500s as the longsword was replaced by the Zweihänder, an even larger steel sword, which emerged as the weapon of choice by frightening forces like the German Landsknecht. More on those guys in a future episode. But while the German longsword may have all but disappeared from battle in the coming centuries, it persisted in another field: fencing. As mentioned before, by the late 1500s the longsword was almost all but erased from battle, but the respect for the art endured through fencing well into the 1700s, though it faced a sharp decline in popularity during the early 1600s as its status was eclipsed by the rapier. Because of its bulky size, the longsword was seen as both old-fashioned and obsolete when compared to the more compact and easy-to-draw nature of the rapier. Whereas before the German school of the longsword was a shining badge of respect, by the 1700s its sheen had dulled to near obscurity. With the death of one of the final living members of the Marksbrüder, otherwise known as the Brotherhood of St. Mark, in 1862, it seemed that the tradition, having reached nearly 500 years of rich history at that point, was on its way out. Loyal practitioners kept the flame alive for as long as they could, but by the end of the 1800s, the German school of longsword fencing was facing extinction. That is, until a British Army officer by the name of Alfred Hutton came along in the late 1800s. Though Hutton was primarily focused on Italian and English tradition and had no ties whatsoever to the German system, Hutton's preservation and study of historical treatises perhaps unwittingly caused a rebirth in fascination for historical fencing traditions long since past, including the art of the German longsword. But it wasn't until decades after the conclusion of World War II, in other words only very recently, that the revival began. We can thank the long line of historians and museums over the centuries that kept the original manuscripts in pristine condition, as well as the numerous modern historians like Guy Windsor, Christian Tobler, Michael Chittister, and more, who are responsible for commissioning the translations, transcriptions, and accessible book forms for fencers like myself to continue studying the art and keeping it alive for future generations. Well, that's all for today's episode. If you're interested in learning more about the practical art of longsword fencing, consider checking out my online lessons available on Patreon. I'll link to that in the description. As always, thank you for watching, and I wish you safe journeys and happy training.